Our guest speaker tonight, I hadn't had the opportunity to meet before. I rode down here with him this evening. He's got a brand new car, real fine rig, got a tape player in it and the whole works. I thought last night probably I ought to find him and meet him and visit with him a little bit so I'd know what to say this evening to introduce him. And I went to his motel room and he wasn't there. His wife said he was out in the car. I went out in the car and he was sitting in the car and he had one of his tapes on humility and he was sitting there listening to it. We're very fortunate, and I am real happy to introduce Joe L. from Tyler, Texas.
That's the prettiest cowboy I've ever been introduced by. If they took his boots off, he'd be a midget down in Texas. My name is Joe, and I'm a wino. And I'd love to say to the little preacher over here that we hire Tom out for these things at a pretty small fee. You can have him for services in the morning. And I'm supposed to be a comic, I guess. I've been laughing ever since I got sober. But I've been going around this conference about half blubbering ever since I've been here. Every time I think about the perpetuation of this wonderful society, I kind of get a tear in my eye. And these folks on the outside, the preacher and the mayor, are not as fortunate as we are. They don't get to see the things that we do. We get to see God's handiwork every day. And see it at work. Did you know just 2 short years ago, there were 2 guys here in Baker and AA. And another one showed up and said, let's do something. And here we sit some 300 strong tonight. Don't talk to me about God, these folks who don't believe. This could be nothing else but. But I can't be serious too long about being sober. And I couldn't let the little preacher get away without telling the story about the drunk that went to church to get cured of his alcoholism. It happened down in our country, and the poor guy had all the symptoms that we had. He had the brown whimpers, and shaking all over. And he went into the back of this church on Sunday morning and sat on his hands like we used to do. And there came a long, tall, hungry-looking preacher out, and he took for his text that morning, Peter's wife's mother lay sick with a high fever. And he preached for 2 hours, and the poor drunk like to have died. But he didn't give up. And he went out into the far edge of the city that night and thought he'd try again. And he went in and sat down on the back seat and sat on his hands, and lo and behold, that's Scripture. This same long, tall, hungry-looking preacher came out. And he took for his text that night, Peter's wife's mother lay sick with a high fever. and he gave it the 2-hour treatment. The next morning, the poor drunk was riding on the streetcar, sitting next to some lady, and the streetcar stopped to let a funeral procession go by, and she said, "I wonder who died." And he said, "I guess it's Peter's wife's mother. She's sicker than hell all day yesterday." I'm have a hard time getting started. One of the most common complaints we hear in AA from the drunk when he comes in is he wonders how he lived long enough to get here. And after listening to some of these Al-Anons, I wonder how they lived long enough to get here. You know, that chipping away at you. Did you ever suffer that? My wife used to, well, they say to the drunk, "Where have you been?" "Nowhere." Well, you and I know that it's physically impossible to be nowhere. "What have you been doing?" "Nothing." "How much have you had to drink?" "2 beers." My wife had a little thing that dented my psyche. I used to come in and drunk Saturday night and sleep late Sunday morning, or try to. And she'd crank up this goddamn vacuum sweeper and hit the foot, each leg of that bed. And if you know what suffering is to have a hangover and then let them hit, oh God. I still hate one. We keep ours in the garage. I don't let them look at me. And I belong to a minority group, too. I'm a genius. And I've listened a long time to experts that talk about alcoholics and all the societies and people who know how to treat us. And I'm just about sick of it. Because that wasn't the way I came to AA. I came to AA because I felt bad. Because it was uncomfortable. And there wasn't a dab of genius left in me when I got here. So if I have anything to say tonight, it will be no reflection upon the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. It will be an attempt to tell you how I felt. I took my first drink at age 17 to be accepted in a group of youngsters. I remember it as vividly as though it were yesterday. Wanted to be accepted in a group, and I got drunk that night. Incidentally, I got drunk on every subsequent attempt to drink alcohol. I got drunk the last time I took a drink of alcohol. But I found something in that drink that night that these other fellas didn't find. I know that. I found something that these other fellas didn't find. I know some of them yet today in my hometown, and they continue to remain in the realm of social drinkers, if there is such a thing. I have a very humble opinion about social drinking, and that is that if you take the most pious and unctuous old sister out of the church and throw about 8 slugs of that gallow in her, she's going to become unsocial as hell. I never did drink socially. Never did drink spiritually. I've heard fellas talk about that. Took a little dope spiritually a couple of times, but never did drink spiritually. I drank because I liked it. In our book of experience, the doctor's opinion, he says that men and women drink essentially because they like the effects produced by alcohol. That's the reason I drank. Nothing mysterious about it. And it was not compulsive. I found myself in Southern California, a young kid out of East Texas who had migrated to Hollywood, of all places. And of all the professions for a drunk to choose, I was an understudy to one of the more eminent designers of lingerie. This is where you cut these soft, silk, sleazy, intimate things that you ladies wear. Now, if any of you got a pinch, I've been away from there a long time. I didn't have nothing to do with it. Very pleasant profession. You use models. Now, we have a step in Alcoholics Anonymous for some of you folks. It's the second one that kind of infers that you might have a gopher in the garden, you know. A second step where we talk about our sanity, and this is very offensive to a drunk. Nothing wrong with my head, you know. Well, let me tell you something. If you cut a bunch of braziers with 3 of those places in them, you're nuts. I told a psychiatrist about that, and he said it was just wishful thinking. Well, it's needless to say that I cut myself out of that profession. And I guess it was the first encounter that I had with the fact that I couldn't drink. I drank with my boss, a little Jewish fellow there in Hollywood, and we would go out places at night, and this is what hurts the drunk. We would both drink together. Yet in the morning he came to work just as fresh as he could be, springing from one place to another, just being the perfect executive. And do you know how I looked? I had to sit in the back of the streetcar and drink 2 hot beers to even get down there. This is the difference. And I hated his guts because he could drink and I couldn't. And one day he came to me and told me, he said, "Joe, you got to go." All of us have heard that, I guess. I'm say this very frankly, I'm into my 5th profession as a result of being an alcoholic. And this is the beginning of the perpetual lie. This is the reason that we talk about honesty in AA and how necessary it is that we live. Poor old drunk, he couldn't get his second job if he told about the first one. And this is the process that we follow. So he said, "You got to go." A little Jewish fellow there in Hollywood. And he was as kind as he could be. And he said, "I've got one thing to be thankful for. And that is that you weren't a rabbi, because if you had been, the way you handled those scissors, you'd have destroyed our whole race." Takes a little while to get your hand on that one, don't it? Well, I left. Really the profession that I was fond of, and I know this was the beginning of many sadnesses and disappointments that went into a progression of this. And it seems to me that when a man is compelled to drink, as we were, that the arrow points down, never up. This is the reason that for the last 2 days we've sat and listened to the beautiful stories of recovery. Last night Virginia, and today Don and Avis. And do you know why to us they're so pretty? Because they point up. Never heard a story of recovery that didn't point up. Service and action. I remember one of the kindest things that Chuck ever said was, if you would know the shepherd better, help him tend his sheep. This is what it's all about. It's what it's all about. So all of our stories point up. We can't get down much more than we are in AA, can we? So I go in search of another job. And I went down, the war was going on at that time. And I went to the shipyard. I went down to the Union Hall and paid and bought a plumber's license to go into the shipyard as a master plumber. This is a fellow who had never picked up anything heavier than a pair of scissors. And I went into the shipyard as a master plumber, a master fraud, if you please. And those were the days when you were frozen to your job. Do any of you remember this revolting situation? Frozen to your job. I thawed out. I have a piece of paper that hangs in my den at home now. It's a pink piece of paper like that, and it's signed by the United States Department of War Labor. And it prohibits me from working within 25 miles of the city of Los Angeles. This is where the executive in us comes to light. We put our wives to work, huh? God damn, we can't get a job. Go get one. Well, job number 2. Things were getting a little tighter then, and I moved up into Northern California. You know, the theory of the treatment for alcoholism has been one thing down through the centuries. Up until the advent of our society, when somebody stopped and took enough time to try to understand one of us. But the treatment has always been, keep him moving. Hadn't it? No family likes to admit they got one of us, and my family sure as hell had one. Keep him moving. And we move from one place to another. And we've gone through this sad song of saying to one another, my wife and I, let us go somewhere else. Maybe it'll be better. Maybe it'll be better. Well, the only thing wrong with the theory of moving an alcoholic from one place to another is that when you get there, he's there too. But this has been the treatment. Keep him moving. Hadn't it? I went up into Northern California and got a job, of all places, on the railroad. And I'd love to say here that these folks are a group of the most narrow-minded people I've ever come in contact with. They have a rule about drinking. They say that if you're seen coming out of an establishment that dispenses alcoholic beverages, you can be discharged. Well, I never came out very often. Maybe under duress and coercion. Those are nice words. But I guess they felt, and they were justified in their feeling, that They run more than one train on a track, and that if a man was a little bit addled, he might mix them up, And this is just exactly what I did. Maybe you'll understand some of the vernacular or the parlance of the railroad man, but at the top of the Sierras coming out of Sacramento, you use a whole flock of engines, used to in the old days, pushing a train up to the top of the mountain. And when you get to the top, they had a thing that was called an electronic system, where they shifted these engines around and did a quick thing there with them, electronically. And they made the mistake of hanging a bulletin up. Railroads put bulletins everywhere. And they said in this bulletin, in essence, that it was physically impossible to make a mistake up there. Well, hell, that's a challenge to any drunk. Why, I don't know of a one I was here that could have left that alone. Well, that worried me in the night. Couldn't make a mistake. And by some quirk of alcoholic circumstance, I got two engines going towards one another with 4 cars between them, carrots, apples, lettuce, and celery, and made the biggest goddamn fruit salad in history. And these narrow-minded people wanted to fire me. They didn't. I had another alcoholic representing me at the investigation, and he proved some of the most atrocious lies you've ever heard. And he got me off of 60 days. And I remember the old superintendent. He was a kind, compassionate fellow. I used to send him a Christmas card every year after he fired me. He came to me and he said, "Look, I'll get you if it's the last thing I ever do." I said, you ought to be arrested for even walking on our right-of-way. These are not funny then. So then we begin, my wife and I, of going through the years of making excuses one for another. Making excuses for something that we didn't know existed. Oh, you've heard the plea of the wife. Oh, he's a nice fellow when he's sober. Have you ever heard that? One old lady had the audacity to ask my wife, said, "Well, when is he sober?" Yeah. Making excuses one for another. Not knowing what was wrong with them. Go around with your guard up all the time. I remember, I'm going to tell this, and my wife always gets mad at me for telling it, but I'm going to tell it anyway. We were living with her sister. This was a beautiful relationship. During the war, and one day I had been in the bar all day, drinking, of course, napping a little and then drinking some more, this beautiful state that you get into. And along about 4 in the afternoon, I went home to my wife's sisters and went in and fell upon the bed, and it was the same picture that had happened many times before. And they thought I was asleep. Always had been. And my wife in hysteria cried out to her sister, and she said, "Oh my God," said, "what would you do if you were living with a man like that?" And her sister didn't hesitate a moment. She said, "I'd poison the son of a bitch." Let me tell you something. From then on, they ate first. I promised to try to tell you how a drunk feels. Have any of you ever felt that little? Our book of experience tells us that we live a life of no defense. Have absolutely no defense. It seems. Have you ever felt that small? No, I think this was the compulsion beginning. This was the time when... This is hard to explain to the average layman, to the preacher, to the doctor, to the executive about a man drinking against his own will. This is the hardest thing. I've given it up entirely, trying to convince the non-alcoholic why I drank. When I first came to AA, I used to enjoy it. It's an exercise in boredom. But about the time I would get heated into my dissertation about why I drank, one of these good souls would look me on the eyeball and say, "What did you want to drink for in the first place?" So I gave it up. And I never did find much understanding about this compulsion until the night I came to AA. This is where I found the answer to the whole thing. But we live in a world of being misunderstood. We go to a point where we don't even recognize ourselves. I think sometimes the poor guy, when he comes to AA, don't really know how he feels himself. When I came to AA, society had very near convinced me that I was like they said I was. Just very near. I want to tell you a nauseous little episode in my drinking to prove that a poor old drunk can orient himself to any situation. It used to be one of our trustees back in New York that I sobered up with, and he used to say that when folks said when you could smell yourself, other folks been smelling you 3 days. But I'll tell you this little story, and it's about some of my wife's favorite pets. We lived in a little place called Goose Creek, Texas. Mary and I have always had cats. Always. Never have been without them. We love them. There's something about a cat that I like. He's meticulous in his actions. But she went up into Illinois to visit her sister while she had a baby, and while she was gone, I got fired from my job, and I had to go back to Tyler, Texas. And I loaded all of our belongings, which were few, in the back of this little 1931 Chevrolet. And I left Goose Creek via Houston towards Tyler. And as I remember, it was a cold, damp evening. And as I approached the outskirts of Houston, I saw a sign that read 3 pints for the price of 2. Not being one to pass up a bargain, I bought the 3 pints for the price of 2 and started driving. And I remember how pleasant it was. What a sense of well-being I had that night. And the frost was on the windows of this old car, and I drove along and sang a little bit, and talked to myself. You never have done that, have you? And I got to a little town, if I remember right, it was Cleveland, Texas, and I got out to get some chaser, and one of these damn cats got out. And I knew that I dare not come home without the cat. And I chased him all over the little town there in this red mud, and finally treed him up under a cotton gin down there on my hands and knees, half drunk. and drug him out by one of his feet, and I whipped him all the way back to the car, and I threw him in the back seat of this hot car, and he did a thing in that back seat that wasn't nice. And I crawled right in and took off and drank a little. Didn't bother me, really. And about 2 in the morning, I threw up in the front seat. Drove along and sang to myself. You've done that, haven't you? And as it came daylight, I parked in a little one-street town. There were a couple of street lights, and I pulled over in front of one of the street lights to get the cap off of that jug. And there was a town clown walking down the street. This constable, he was a sheriff of sorts or something, door rattler. And I guess it was the first opportunity he'd had in ages to make an arrest. And he came up and knocked on that window and said, "Let that glass down." And I slowly let the glass down, and he said, "What do you think?" Oh, my God. And slowly walked away. And I sometimes grow weary of hearing some of these people stand up and try to make alcoholism a dainty disease. It ain't dainty, it's offensive, it's obnoxious. People give us short shrift, and we just as well to expect it. And when the old boy comes to AA and he smells a little bad, think nothing of it. Because if you put your arm around him and give him the thing they gave me, you'll forget what he smells like, I'll tell you. Well, the physical end of alcoholism caught up with me. I got down and had gotten on wine quite by accident. That sounds good, don't it? I got on wine because I couldn't drink nothing else. And I was in California, and it was a very reasonable drink, as some of you old pros know. And I remember with the first drink of it, how ashamed I was of myself. I remember how I felt. And I remember how I was working on the railroad and running one of their most exclusive passenger trains from Sacramento to Reno, the city of San Francisco. The pretty guy with the gold buttons. And in Reno, I would go to the far end of the street until I could find a bar room that didn't have anybody in it so I could drink my wine. I got on it. A little bartender showed it to me in Sacramento. One morning I was sick, and he said, over there behind the bar is some wine, and he said, you can take a couple of drinks of that and go back to whiskey. And I would like to say here that I have never been back to whiskey. I like what that wine does to you. I really do. It's kind of like a closed umbrella, and then it gets down there and opens up all of a sudden. They talk in the scriptures of those people who speak in a babble in an unknown tongue. Friend, if you'll drink that gallo, you'll talk many ways, I'll tell you. And this was where I found myself, more ashamed than ever, but still not knowing what was wrong. I never heard the word alcoholism. In those days, I'd heard the word wino. Friend, I heard that way early, but I never had heard anything about alcoholism. And I stepped over these cats going from my hotel to work. And I suppose if I had any compassion for them, it would be the fact that they didn't have enough to buy another drink. And I got down. Completely. I don't know how long it lasted in one of the hotels in Sacramento. And it doesn't make a lot of difference. Doesn't make a lot of difference. But I got up somehow out of sheer brute force and awkwardness, and I staggered home to Mary. And I think really, in retrospect, if I remember correctly, I cried out to her. And I said, I think I'm sick. I never had been sick before, except this irping sick that you get in the morning. And I thought everybody threw up every morning. I didn't know. It was a way of life with me. I used to rent a hotel room with twin beds in it, one to sleep in, one to throw up in. It was just that simple. But Mary bought it. And she said, let's call a doctor. And we didn't have any family physician. Nothing ever been wrong with us. And the railroad had a rule about drinking that I mentioned a while ago, and I was very reluctant to call them. But we were forced to. And there was a little unsuspecting physician. God, how those fellows act. And he came down, and the poor Al-Anon had to say it again. None of you ever been guilty of this, I know. Here I lay with all the symptoms of a chronic alcoholic, and the little doctor says to her, does he drink? She said. Why in the hell won't they get on this too? They want us to. And he gave me a shot of the happy medicine in the arm, and he gave her a prescription for some of the most delightful pills. 1 grain phenobarbital. And he said to her, this man is sick. Hell, he wasn't breaking no news to me. And he's got to be in hospital. And they loaded the ambulance back to the door, and amidst great fanfare and a pathetic scene of her following the corpse down. And we take off for San Francisco with the red light on and the siren screaming, making 90 miles an hour, and I'm up in the back eating them pills. I've always looked back on that trip with a feeling of irony. Here's a drunk, been drunk for 18 years, and they're in a hell of a hurry to do something about it. This is the non-alcoholic application to our disease. And when I got to the hospital, it was 2 days before I saw a doctor. I guess they were out testing cigarettes, or breaking the laxative habit, or something. I don't know. The science has made some great strides recently. And they put me through one of the most stringent clinics on the West Coast, from the top of my head to the bottom of my feet. And it ain't a lot of fun with the shakes. And the only thing I found out of that was that you shouldn't go to a proctologist with a hangover. But the result of this was that I had nothing organically wrong with me. And this was my introduction to psychiatry. And I would love to humbly make an observation here that the members of Alcoholics Anonymous of my acquaintance who have had their alcoholism beaten out of them through their knees with a rubber mallet are very few. But they brought in this frustrated piano tuner. And he beat on my knees and asked me silly questions, and I gave him the most brilliant of answers. I understood he later had some trouble. Real brilliant. He asked me once, did you ever suck your thumb? And I never will remember how he quivered when I said, yes, I still do. And I described to him graphically how I'd go off in the corner and take a quick pull at it when nobody was looking. This'll drive them crazy. Now that's gilding the non-existent lily, I think, to say you're driving them crazy. And I'll tell you how. I know none of you ever going to drink again after hearing me here tonight. So I'll tell you how to get rid of a psychiatrist. This is a surefire method for getting rid of psychiatrists. You let two drunks lay up in bed one night and memorize the same dream to tell him the next morning. This will drive them out of their mind. I found another little dose in the hospital. I had by that time acquired wine and then the phenobarbital, and we were letting those run concurrently. And then this doctor prescribed a dose that some of our girls in AA are quite fond of, and that's bromide. He prescribed sodium bromide elixir. That's the granddaddy of nervine. You know what nervine, Aunt Minnie used to drink it, and they'd say, Aunt Minnie can't come out today, she's nervous. Well, she couldn't come out, she's stoned. And there's not much wrong with that, except your eyes will cross and you'll froth at the mouth a little bit, but it's a hell of a fine dose. And the food doesn't disturb it. This is the marvelous part of it. And one day this skull jockey came into my ward and with more of a tic than usual. And he said, you can go home now. And you would have thought that he had performed a delicate piece of brain surgery. He was the happiest guy I ever saw. And then he gave me an admonition that no drunk should ever hear. He said, go home and get plenty of rest. Rest from what? I hadn't worked in months. And you guys coming into AA, don't bite on that bit. One of my sponsors was a narcotic addict who took 6 grains a day when he got off of it. And as long as he lived until the day he died, he never slept. Must have been a hellish existence, but he was willing to go to any length to stay sober. So rest may not be so necessary for us. It's mighty good to have. It's one of the little things that keep me sober in AA, is the ability to not be tired anymore. But he said, go home, get plenty of rest, and I fell off of the train in Sacramento with a jug of bromide in one hand and 125 phenobarbital tablets in the other. And I thought I had my cake and I could eat it. I had a disease. I had run the whole gamut from nervous anxiety to schizophrenia and back while I was in the hospital. They said I was an ambulatory schizophrenic. You know what that is? An ambulatory schizophrenic, as well as I can tell, is a going Jesse with dual wheels. But this was a little respite. Mary was gainfully employed until a bartender double-crossed me. And he called her one day and he said, Mrs. Leaf said you think your husband is sick. Said when you go to work in the morning, he gets up and comes down here. Said then he runs home at 11:30 and gets in bed and lets you come home and prepare his meal. Then when you go back to work, he gets up and comes down here. And he added another little thing, we don't want him. And this was a blow to Mary. She had set great store by the treatment at the hospital, and she became quite perturbed and picked up the phone and called a psychiatrist in San Francisco, and I don't know what he told her, but this was when she left. And I say that without any rancor in my heart whatsoever, because I think that you and me, in our dependency, will cling to every crutch at hand. We'll cling to every crutch at hand to perpetuate our drinking. And the absence of my wife was only the absence of another crutch. And I got over it. I had a few left. Some of my railroad buddies loaded me into their baggage car and they shipped me back to the hospital. I had a little keister with a jug of wine in it. Still going. And I stayed in there another 3 months and went through 2 more psychiatrists, both of whom have never been the same since. One of these I got to tell you about him. He looked like a psychiatrist. He had a Van Dyke beard and the thick glasses, and they sent out to the University of Berkeley and brought him in to be sure they found out what made me tick. And I remember he didn't talk English and I didn't talk what he talked, but he got one question through to me, was, do you wet the bed? And that's always bothered me, because I know that's a result of drinking and not a cause of it. Hell, I've killed more potted plants in bad weather. Well, they finally threw me out of that joint. Too good. I'd bedded in for the winter, and this guy came back and told me again. He said, you got to get out of here and let some sick people come in this hospital. I had been going around cheering up some of the patients, and they had taken my clothes away from me and given me one of these little things that don't cover just all it ought to cover, and I was rather humiliated most of the time. And he said, where will you go? And I had paraded this story around the hospital about my wife leaving. But I used to make it more dramatic than that. I would say, she left me and took everything. Hell, she should have took it. She earned it. She accumulated it. But it made a good story in the bar. And he said, well, where are your folks? And I said, well, they're down in Texas. And I think his eyes lit up. He said, go down there by all means. Keep him moving. Keep him moving. And I went to Texas and found a little small town psychiatrist down there that was a lonely little fella. And he loved to talk, and I'd go sit and listen to him talk, and he'd give me goofballs with a popcorn sack full. And I had it made again until one morning I woke up out of a very deep sleep, and there were 2 deputy sheriffs looking down at me. And they said, get up and come on and go with us. My mother had blown the whistle. I remember this vividly. It wasn't my first jail, nor was it my last, but there was something particularly humiliating about this. And when I kind of came unshuckled from these pellets up in that jail and began to function a little, I remember how filled I was with the bitter hate. How these people, I had come home, the genius no less. And this is what they thought of me, to have me locked up and humiliated in the local pokey there. And if there ever was a man that was filled with a burning hate for his own mother, it was me. No, I think this is part of the disease too. Part of the disease too. Not been there about 5 days when a stranger, a man whom I'd never seen, came to my boudoir with the vertical Venetian blind. One of the most peaceful looking guys I've ever seen. Never saw him before. And he came up and asked for me by name, and he talked to me through those cell bars, and he said, Joe, I've had a lot of trouble with my drinking. And he stood there and gave me what we've come to know as the AA pitch. And he told me all about himself. And yet I was filled with such a bitter hatred and a bitter resentment that I turned him away. But he put the hex on me. And I think the reason that I was so touched by this man's visit was the fact that I couldn't make him react. Everybody that I'd ever talked to in my life, I had cut at them and knifed them until I made them react some way or other. And this guy wouldn't move. Damn him. As calm and as peaceful and evidencing the serenity of one who is completely at peace with himself. This is the guy that came to see me in jail. Told me all about AA. And you know what I asked him? I said, who sent you to see me? This is who I particularly wanted to hate. I went to see an old boy down in Texas not so long ago, and he was rolled up on the bed in that sheet like a pencil. And he looked up at me with bloodshot eyes, and he said, who turned me into that outfit? And I know just exactly how he felt. Know just how he felt. And this guy couldn't ruffle him. Couldn't ruffle him. And he wouldn't talk about me. He talked about himself exclusively. And he gave me what a lot of people have had tried to describe is the message of AA. And to me, the message of AA is comprised of 5 words. 5 alone. And these are the first time I'd ever heard it. And these 5 words are, I know how you feel. Nobody had ever told me that before. Most everybody that had ever talked to me, I felt like they were looking down at me. This censorship and this criticism and this gouging and picking. And this guy looked right on an even keel. And he said, my friend, I know how you feel. This is the message of AA. And I sometimes grow weary sitting around the clubs with us drunks who have fattened the wrinkles out of them stomach and let them hear somebody say, if he wants it, let him come get it. I do not hold with that theory. You're looking at a man who is sober because some guy came to see him unsolicited. If they'd waited for me to call them, they'd have waited yet. I'm alive today, and I well know this, because a guy believed in God. And if I remember some of the words verbatim of our 2 co-founders, Bill and Bob, when they discovered the principles of this society would work with each other, the 2 of them. These are the words that they said. let us go out and find another drunk. I asked Bill about that in Indianapolis not too long ago, and he wouldn't even take credit for it. He said, I guess Bob said it. So you see, I'm doubly grateful for the fact that the guy came to see me. This is what it's all about. But I didn't come to AA. It wasn't a matter of go forth and sin no more with me. Couldn't take her. Had too much hatred, had too much resentment. This thing is a malady that you don't get over with in a few minutes. He went back and reported to my mother, and I guess he said something to her. You know, she said, is he all right now? This is that. And he said, no, I don't believe your son wants to go to AA right now. And she said, well, what'll we do? Being the wise woman that she is, if we let him out, he'll get drunk. And he said a thing that is so true of our disease. He said to her, yes, he will. His condition demands it. Yes, he will. Well, my people are pretty respectable people down there. None of them ever been hung for stealing horses. And they hired 2 deputy sheriffs to load me into a police car and take me from Tyler, Texas to Houston, Texas, which is 200 miles, and sit in the depot with me until the train went west. Keep him moving. And we stand up in AA and yak a lot of times about our suffering and how we rise above it. Yeah, we get real egotistical sometimes and brag about it. I don't remember too much of the physical suffering that I was in. You know what I remember about it? I remember the humiliations and the indignities that I heaped down upon myself. And I never did have an answer to say to folks why it was happening to me. This is what I remember. This is what I lay in bed and think about sometimes, and thank God that I don't have to carry it with me over one day at a time. And as I sat in that depot this day with these 2 big burly fuzzies on either side of me, their pistols showing, I knew that everybody was looking at me. I told you I'd tell you how a drunk felt. And if one ever felt low that day, I felt it. They loaded me on the train that night and got up in there and helped me find a seat. And this is not a quick way to make friends on a train. And I got off in San Antonio, Texas, and filled a bag up with the only thing I know to fill a bag up with, Gallo wine. And they carried me off of that train in Los Angeles in a wheelchair. I'd kind of set up shop in one of the toilets, and some smart aleck said, well, we got to use this car. It goes up and down. You can't live here. And they took me and 3 dirty old bags that I had tenaciously clung to and put them on the foot of this wheelchair and rolled me out. A lot of you folks know about the old Southern Pacific Depot in Los Angeles. Into the front foyer and dumped me. Very unceremoniously dumped me right out in front. And with all the jocular remarks that I might make, all the fun that we have looking back in retrospect at the ridiculous antics of an alcoholic, I would like to say to you that for the next 5 months I went through a literal hell. And I drank as few people have and lived to tell the tale. And I ended up in one of the dirtiest skid rows in the country at that time in Sacramento under the bridge. And every time I come into an AA club, and see hanging on the wall a little sign, "But for the grace of God." This is the way I got out. Folks say, "How'd you get out of that place?" A lot of them didn't. In those days, it was not uncommon for 4 or 5 of them to walk off in the river. This was a hell on earth. I think they've cleaned it up a little now. But I kept looking in one of these bags, and every time I opened one, this fellow that had come to see me in jail had given me a little pamphlet, and he had put his name and his address on the back of it. And the heading on this thing, it was a piece of literature that had been printed in the South in those days, and it read like this: "Slaves of drink find peace of mind." And I never had the guts to read it, but I didn't have the guts to throw it away. And it seemed like the old shell game in a stupor. At nights when I'd open one of these damn bags, that thing was always on top. And I got up and staggered out of that place and made a beeline for the guy that had given it to me. Oh, a drunk's got to be dramatic. I went 2,600 miles. Slept under a few bridges and in a few jails to get back to this guy. And I later found out that there was an AA club 3 blocks away in Sacramento. But when I got back, this guy's message hadn't changed a bit for just me. I believe the sweet little gal here talked about altered attitudes. That's what happened. I went looking for him. And this is the beautiful thing about our society. Most other societies or endeavors have anything to do with the human beings about a one-shot affair. Usually, most everything I came in contact with is a one-shot affair. And here's a guy who had been insulted in jail, who had talked to this arrogant, self-satisfied stinker, who could have well said, "He don't want it," and he was willing to come again. God forbid, and I'm glad he did. I'm glad he did. And I think that if any efficacy of God's handiwork in AA would be the second trip. I don't know how long you worked with a drunk. I worked with one down in East Texas for 4.5 years. He was a stinker like me. I went to see him, and he was verging on DTs, and I loaded him in my car. Dear old Joe, I was full of benevolence. And I borrowed a big goblet full of whiskey and poured down him, knocked him out, really. And I carried him to AA. When he kind of woke up from that drink, he was sitting in an AA club. I believe any way you can get him there, good. And he stayed sober for 3 months. Then he got drunk. It was a blow to my ego. By God, he will sober up under my direction, with my spiritual experience. And I went and got him again. Brought him back and sobered him up. 3 months, drunk again. And he had a little affliction that I know none of you have ever had. He'd go to far away places and call me Colette. To tell me that he was drunk. But he had discredited me. And I was determined that he was going to get sober. And I went and got him again. And this went on for 4.5 years. And about 7 years ago, he got in one of our local motels and got on for him what I hoped was his last drunk. And he called another fella from our club who's not half as smart as I am. And he went out and talked to that bastard 10 minutes, and he's been sober ever since. I hated his guts. I'd sit in the club and look at him and think, you ought to be mine. And if I know anything of the treasure of God's handiwork, if I've learned anything of God's handiwork, I owe him more than he owes me. He kept me sober for 4.5 years. Now, there's a hell of a lot I don't know about what God does. I ain't going to try to tell you a whole lot of it. All I know is what I've seen. And I believe it was Emerson who said, the things that I have seen teaches me to have faith in my Creator for the things I have not seen. I'll buy that. I'll buy that. So the guy makes the second trip and he takes me to AA. Why are they all upstairs? And he shoved me up this old dirty stairs. They were kind of cut on the bias, and it was dark. And I remember in those days, we used to stand downtown on the front of the club. This was when there was a stigma on alcoholism. And we thought nobody was looking, then we'd duck upstairs. Didn't want nobody to see it. And now the biggest problem in AA is to keep out the social climbers. I go to the only AA group in the world, unless somebody corrects me, where one of our members insists on parking his Rolls Royce in the front door. These are the poor alcoholics that we've worked with down there. But he shoved me up there that night. And I've had to compare every other AA meeting with that one. And I think that if we assume any obligation, when we come to AA, we assume the obligation of what we show the drunk the night he comes. This is where he makes it or breaks it. I got up there that night and my eyes wouldn't focus. These pills hadn't left me long enough. And I don't remember, they were having a study group that night, and I don't remember any of the words that were said in the meeting that night. But I remember one thing. I remember experiencing a communication. A communication, and I said to myself, here are some people like me. Here are some people like me. And the sickening loneliness that plagues every old drunk as long as he sits on that stool, left me that night. And thank God it has never returned. This is what I found in AA. The loss of the most lonely existence that one could imagine. I found some people like me, and up until that time I thought that I was the only one that had been dealt this dirty hand. I knew that I was the only one like me. And that night I got the very essence of our program. There was an old sheriff walked up to me that night who had locked me up in his jail 12 years prior to that time for felonious drunk driving, if you please. And when I went to AA that night, there he stood, sober 2 years. And he came up and put his arm around me. And he said, I love you, boy. And you can stay sober like I do. The gift you can't match. Here was the symbol of everything I hated. The symbol of everything I hated. And he put his arm around me, and he died sober a few years later. But I owe him a lot. I owe him quite a lot for the new way of life. About all she wrote. Well, we didn't live happily ever afterwards, of course. And I would be very reluctant to tell a new person that when they come to Alcoholics Anonymous that all your troubles will fly away. This ain't so. But I got well in a hurry. In fact, 2 weeks I got well. I read it all, I listened to it all, and I became an expert. I quit cussing. I did was just nice as I could be. In fact, you might say that I became godlike. Have you ever seen any AA members who are godlike? And then I got a call one night to go see a drunk down in a bar, and they'd taken his jug away from him. And all he wanted, really, was to get his jug back, but he was using me. And I loaded a friend of mine in my nice new automobile, and we go down and pick up the drunk in his jug and put him between us, and I began to give him the pitch. And as we slowly drove along, I talked with eloquence, and I just knew I was going to get him. I felt so good. Have you ever felt that good? And as we drove slowly, his eyes began to water, and I thought, I'm getting him. And I gave him a few more eloquent plums, and he gently lay his head over on my shoulder. And I knew I had it. Did you ever hear of anybody throwing up silently? Every time I've ever gotten godlike with a drunk, he pukes on me. Enough of this. There is no treasure like a man reborn. This I fully believe. And we could stand up here and bat our gums forever about how grateful we are for being sober. This is an utter impossibility. But maybe I could tell you a little story about a call on a sick guy. And we won't take it from this book, we'll take it from the preacher's book. This is the story about a call that is made on a fella, and there's only difference between one of us going and this call that happened 2,000 years ago. There was a fellow, as the Bible describes him, it is written by a doctor, so you know that it's very abstract. A fellow by the name of Luke wrote it. And it's the story of the demoniac. They describe him as a wild man. Said that he was so wild that no man could tame him. Kind of like me. Said that the manifestations of his disease were such that they kept him in fetters and chains. Kind of like me. Pure man. I think they called him a demoniac for the lack of better verbiage. At this day and time, they would have probably analyzed him, called him a catatonic or a bedwetter or something, but they called him a demoniac because he was a maniac full of demons. Kind of like me. And as the story goes, he got so bad that they ran him out of town. Like me. And he ended up out on the riverbank eating with the pigs. And if your imagination is as strong as mine, you can see the picture. The babble, the dirty clothes, and the aforementioned odor. Yeah, I can see the perfect picture. And it seems that at that time there was a little carpenter fella who was going about the country teaching a new philosophy of love, and he had a thing that none of us have quite acquired. He could see no ill in anyone. We're working at it, but we ain't made it. The little carpenter could see no ill in anyone, and he said to this guy, this sick fella, he said, "Say, you're having some trouble, ain't you?" And he said, "Trouble is my name. They call me Legion, which means many. A lot of trouble." The little carpenter knew that he needed some help, and he gave it to him. If you know the story, the manner in which this guy was healed was as unusual as maybe ours is today. It ended up with the loss of some pigs that ran down into the sea from the evil spirits, and they were a bunch of stew pigeons around watching this thing, and they ran into the city, didn't they, and told those folks, it says, "You're out of the pig business." And they came out real upset. And they were more interested in the material loss of the pigs than they were in the effect of one guy getting well. By God, and hey, we better be interested in one man getting well, too. Let me tell you something. And then they said some words that we have in our program, and I like it. He said when they got there he sat, fully clothed and in his right mind. We got a step like that, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Here the sick guy sits, fully clothed and in his right mind. These folks still weren't impressed a great deal about one feller getting well. And as the Scripture goes, it said that it prevailed upon them to leave, didn't it? Get out of here. And I can see the little fellow, timid, like we were the night we came to AA, having left one life and never experiencing the good of another, not knowing what to do, and he turned to the man, like I turned to my sponsor. And he said, "Would you let me go with you?" And the little carpenter broke a rule. Broke a rule. Everywhere else that he'd ever helped anybody, he had told them, "Go out here and let everybody see. Or don't say anything about it," hadn't he? Didn't he tell the blind man that? But he broke a rule with this guy. And he gave him an admonishment that I would say to you. Stay here so that others can see what has happened to you. Thank you.